Before we go any further, I think it's maybe important to remind our viewers watching at home of the scale of the destruction of this war, the number of lives that were lost. Can you give us some of the figures?
It's something of a debate, but most historians agree on something between 9 and 10 million. But of course, you have to work in epidemics, you have to work in illnesses. For example, Spanish flu at that time, which was causing an enormous amount of death across the world. So there's a certain amount of margin of error, but 9 or 10 million is usually what people remember.
And of course, there were also not only soldiers that were killed. This had a massive impact on civilians and on society across Europe and around the world.
I mean, we're not talking of the same scale, obviously, as of the Second World War in civilian death. But yes, there were many countries which were very heavily impacted, and many we don't actually think of. The country which was most impacted, if you count population versus death, civilian and military together, is Serbia. The country we don't necessarily think of as being particularly impacted by the First World War, but it definitely was. And of course, there's the whole front line in France, where many civilians died, bombardment, especially behind the front lines.
Just on that point, when we say World War I, we tend to think of these images of barbed wire, the mud of the trenches in northern France. But this was, of course, a global war.
People don't think of combat, for example, in Africa. East Africa, the German colonies, various colonies over Africa, but the battle was particularly intense over East Africa, the Middle East, the Balkans, the fighting in Italy, which keeps getting forgotten. Everybody talks about the Allies and forgets the Italians. So yes, definitely, that's been one of the things we like about the fact that this coverage is so international for today in Paris, is the fact that it actually reflects global progress in historiography as well. We've been moving on as historians to consider the whole world as the theatre of the First World War, and bringing in all these heads of state actually reflects that quite well.
I want to raise it now before we move on, because you are a specialist in British affairs at the Sorbonne, and of course Britain isn't present here in Paris this Sunday.
That's possibly an effect of, for France and Britain are the two countries with possibly the most significant work on memory, the 11th of November being particularly important. I always have to explain this, that for Germany it's very different, which I also know quite well. So for Germany, for example, the 11th of November is not a big deal. But for France and Britain it is, and that means that not having a significant event in London was never going to be possible. So that's possibly one of the reasons why the British aren't as present here today.
But history is about to be made in London this Sunday. Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the German president, will be laying a wreath at the Cenotaph in Whitehall for the very first time. No German leader has ever done that before.
Absolutely. First time ever. Same as yesterday, Angela Merkel's presence at Rotonde was the first time there was a German presence at Rotonde where the armistice was actually signed. So we can see things are happening for the centenary.